The morning sun beat down on Officer Richard Tanner's patrol car as he cruised through the tree-lined streets of Pine Ridge, the kind of neighborhood where lawns stayed green even during water restrictions. 20 years on the force had taught him what belonged in this part of town and what didn't. He liked to think of himself as the neighborhood's guardian, keeping the right kind of community intact. Tanner sipped his lukewarm coffee, grimacing at its bitterness. He'd been up since 5 that morning after arguing with his wife about their son's college applications. The boy wanted to attend a liberal arts school across the country, while Tanner insisted on the local police academy. Following in my footsteps, he told his unimpressed son. The radio crackled with routine updates as he turned onto Maple Drive. That's when he noticed the charcoal gray BMW with tinted windows rolling to a stop in front of the Henderson place. Tanner straightened in his seat. The Hendersons were away in Europe. He knew because he'd signed up to watch their house. He slowed his patrol car, watching as a black man in a tailored suit stepped out of the BMW. The man carried a leather briefcase and checked his watch before heading up the walkway. "Not today," Tanner muttered, pulling his car to the curb and hitting his lights. The man turned at the sound, his expression shifting from confusion to a weary recognition that made Tanner's neck burn. He'd seen that look before. People who thought they knew exactly what he was about. "Good morning, officer," the man called out, his voice deep and measured. "Can I help you?" Tanner approached with one hand resting on his holster, a habit his sergeant had warned him about. "Mind telling me what you're doing at this residence?" The man's expression remained neutral. "I'm here to meet Dr. Henderson. I'm Dr. Andre Thomas. We're colleagues at the National Security Conference. Dr. Henderson and his wife are in Europe," Tanner said, taking satisfaction in the flicker of surprise that crossed the man's face. "I believe you're mistaken. Dr. Henderson returned yesterday. We arranged this meeting last week." He reached slowly for his phone. "I can show you our emails if—" "Keep your hands where I can see them," Tanner snapped. Dr. Thomas froze, then carefully raised his hands to chest level. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but there seems to be a misunderstanding." "ID," Tanner demanded, stepping closer. "My wallet is in my inside jacket pocket." "May I reach for it?" Tanner nodded curtly. With deliberate movements, Dr. Thomas extracted a leather wallet and handed over his driver's license. Tanner studied it. Andre Thomas, 42, from Washington, D.C. The address was in an upscale neighborhood that Tanner had only seen in magazines. "What's your business with Henderson?" Tanner asked, still holding the license. "As I mentioned, we're colleagues. We're collaborating on a security protocol paper that's being presented next month." "Pretty fancy car for a professor," Tanner remarked, glancing back at the BMW. Something hardened in Dr. Thomas's eyes. "I'm not a professor, and I don't believe my choice of vehicle is relevant to why you've stopped me." A curtain twitched in the house across the street. "Mrs. Gladwell." No doubt watching the scene unfold. Good. Tanner liked having witnesses when dealing with difficult individuals. "Sir, this is a neighborhood watch area. We take suspicious activities seriously." "And what exactly is suspicious about meeting a colleague?" Dr. Thomas asked, his voice still calm but with an edge that Tanner didn't appreciate. "Listen, I know the Hendersons. If they were expecting company, they would have mentioned it." As if on cue, the front door of the Henderson home opened, and a middle-aged man appeared, looking confused. "Andre, is everything all right?" Relief washed over Dr. Thomas's face. "Hello, Robert." "Just a small misunderstanding with local law enforcement." Dr. Henderson approached, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with the university logo. "Officer Tanner, what's going on?" "Dr. Thomas is my guest." Tanner felt the first twinge of discomfort. The neighborhood watch reported a suspicious person. Dr. Henderson's eyebrows shot up. "The neighborhood watch? Or did you just see a black man in Pine Ridge and decide he didn't belong?" "That's not what happened," Tanner said, heat rising to his face. "I was told you were in Europe. We came back early. Not that I need to explain my travel schedule to you." Henderson turned to his guest. "Andre, I'm terribly sorry about this." Dr. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. "May I have my ID back, Officer Tanner?" Tanner reluctantly handed it over, but something stubborn in him wouldn't let it drop. "Sir, I'll still need to see some additional identification." "Just following protocol." "Protocol?" Dr. Henderson looked incredulous. "Richard, you've known me for 8 years. I'm vouching for him." But Tanner had gone too far to back down now. "Sir, Please present additional identification, he said to Dr. Thomas, ignoring Henderson. Dr. Thomas sighed, reaching again for his pocket. I'd like to record this interaction if you don't mind. Go ahead, Tanner said, confident in his authority. Dr. Thomas pulled out his phone, set it to record, and placed it on the BMW's hood. Then he reached for his briefcase. My credentials are in here. Open it slowly, Tanner instructed. With practiced patience, Dr. Thomas unlatched the case and removed a small leather folder. He held it out to Tanner, who snatched it with unnecessary force. The world seemed to slow down as Tanner opened the folder and found himself staring at a gold badge and identification card. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Dr. Andre Thomas, Civil Rights Division. Tanner's stomach dropped. He looked up to find Dr. Thomas, Agent Thomas, watching him with those calm, assessing eyes. Is there anything else you need, Officer Tanner? Agent Thomas asked quietly. Neighbors had begun to gather on their lawns, watching the scene unfold. Tanner could feel their eyes on him, hear their whispers. No, sir. Sorry for the confusion. He tried to hand back the credentials, but his fingers felt numb. Agent Thomas accepted his badge. Officer, I understand you're concerned about this community's safety. That's commendable. But I'd suggest examining why you were so certain I didn't belong here, despite evidence to the contrary. Dr. Henderson shook his head. I'll be calling Chief Williams about this, Richard. This isn't the first time something like this has happened in Pine Ridge. Tanner's radio crackled, mercifully breaking the moment. All units, we have a 1050 on Westbrook and Main. He fumbled for his radio. Officer Tanner responding over. As Tanner backed toward his patrol car, Agent Thomas called after him. Officer Tanner, this interaction will be included in my report to your department. I expect we'll be speaking again soon. The drive to the accident scene was a blur. Tanner's thoughts raced between anger, embarrassment, and the dawning realization that he'd made a career-altering mistake. He'd stopped people in Pine Ridge dozens of times without consequence. Why did this have to be an FBI agent? And not just any agent, but one from the Civil Rights Division? By the time he arrived at the fender bender on Main Street, his phone had already buzzed 3 times with messages from his sergeant. Word traveled fast in small departments. He knew what would come next. The review, the footage from his body camera being watched by his superiors, the inevitable meeting with internal affairs. As he mechanically directed traffic around the minor accident, Tanner couldn't shake Agent Thomas's composed face from his mind. There had been no satisfaction there. No gotcha moment, just a steady gaze that seemed to see right through the uniform to the man beneath. Somehow that was worse than anger would have been. His phone buzzed again. The chief this time. My office. End of shift. 20 years on the force, a drawer full of commendations, and a pension just a few years away. Tanner had always thought of himself as one of the good ones, an officer who protected his community with pride. Now, in the harsh light of a Pine Ridge morning, he was forced to consider another possibility, that the very community he'd sworn to protect might be better off without him. The weight of his badge seemed suddenly heavy against his chest. For the first time in his career, Officer Richard Tanner wondered if he deserved to wear it at all. The Pine Ridge Police Department buzzed with unusual energy that afternoon. Officers clustered in small groups, their voices dropping to whispers whenever Tanner passed by. He kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched, as he made his way to Chief Williams' office. Close the door, the chief said when Tanner entered. Williams was a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and 27 years on the force. He'd seen the department through 2 major scandals and countless minor ones. The lines around his mouth deepened as he gestured to the chair across from his desk. Tanner sat, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around the collar. Chief, I can explain. Williams held up a hand. Save it. I've seen the body cam footage. He tapped a key on his computer and swiveled the monitor toward Tanner. There it was, the entire interaction from Tanner's perspective. Somehow it looked even worse than he remembered, the way he'd approached with his hand on his weapon, the dismissive tone when Dr. Thomas, Agent Thomas, had tried to explain, the stubbornness even after Dr. Henderson had vouched for his guest. What were you thinking? Williams asked when the video ended. I was protecting the neighborhood, Tanner said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. The Hendersons were supposed to be out of town. I saw a stranger going up to their door. A stranger in a tailored suit with a briefcase. Williams shook his head. Tell me something, Rick. If that had been a white man in the same suit with the same briefcase, would you have hit your lights? The question hung in the air between them. That's not fair, Tanner finally said. I've pulled over plenty of white folks in Pine Ridge. When they were speeding or running stop signs, sure. Williams leaned back in his chair. But how many times have you stopped someone for simply existing in a neighborhood where you didn't think they belonged? Before Tanner could answer, there was a knock at the door. Sergeant Lisa Chen, head of internal affairs, entered with a folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Tanner had known her for 15 years, long enough to see the disappointment in her eyes. Officer Tanner, she nodded. We need to talk about this morning's incident. She placed the folder on the chief's desk. Agent Thomas has already filed his report. It's thorough. Of course it is, Tanner muttered. Chen raised an eyebrow. I've also received calls from Dr. Henderson and 2 neighbors who witnessed the interaction. They've provided statements. Tanner's stomach nodded. Mrs. Gladwell? Yes, and Mr. Reynolds from across the street. Chen opened the folder. Mrs. Gladwell specifically mentioned that this isn't the first time she's seen you single out people of color in the neighborhood. That's not true, Tanner protested. She's just a busybody who has apparently been keeping track, Chen interrupted. She provided dates and descriptions of 6 separate incidents over the past year. Chief Williams sighed heavily. Rick, you're suspended with pay pending a full investigation. I need your badge and gun. The words hit Tanner like a physical blow. Chief, come on. 20 years on the force and you're taking my badge over one mistake. One mistake? Williams repeated. If that's what you think this is, you haven't been listening. He held out his hand. Badge and gun, now. With stiff movements, Tanner unclipped his badge and removed his service weapon, placing them on the desk. They made a dull thud against the wood. Go home, Rick, Williams said, his voice softening slightly. Take some time to think about what happened today, and what's been happening for years that you haven't wanted to see. Outside the station, Tanner stood in the parking lot, feeling strangely lightweight without his badge and gun. He'd worn them every day for 2 decades. Who was he without them? His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from his wife, Nancy. It's all over Facebook. Call me. Great, just great. The drive home felt like passing through a foreign country. Streets he'd patrolled thousands of times suddenly seemed different, as if the suspension had already changed how he fit into this town. As he pulled into his driveway, Tanner noticed his neighbor, Doug Patterson, quickly turning away and heading inside. So it had begun, the social fallout. In a small town like Pine Ridge, news traveled at light speed. Nancy met him at the door, her face tight with worry. What happened? I got suspended, he said, brushing past her into the kitchen. He needed a drink, I know that, she said, following him. The whole town knows that. I mean, what happened with the FBI agent? What were you thinking? Tanner grabbed a beer from the fridge. I was doing my job. By harassing a black man for standing in front of a house? Nancy crossed her arms. Don't give me that, Rick. I know you better than anyone. He took a long pull from the beer. Meaning what exactly? Meaning I've heard how you talk about certain people who come through Pine Ridge. I've seen the looks you give. I've let it slide because I told myself that's just talk, that you treat everyone fairly when you're in uniform. She shook her head. I wanted to believe that. So now you think I'm a racist? My own wife? He slammed the bottle down on the counter. Perfect. Just perfect. I didn't say that. Nancy's voice was quieter now. I'm saying you've got blind spots, Rick, big ones. And now they've cost you. The doorbell rang before he could respond. They stared at each other for a moment before Nancy went to answer it. Tanner heard a familiar voice in the hallway and groaned inwardly. Roy Jenkins, reporter for the Pine Ridge Gazette. The man was like a bloodhound for controversy. Officer Tanner, Jenkins said as he entered the kitchen, notepad already in hand. Care to comment on this morning's incident with FBI agent Thomas? No comment, Tanner growled. And it's just Mr. Tanner for now, apparently. Jenkins raised his eyebrows. So you've been suspended? Nancy stepped in. Roy, this isn't a good time. We're dealing with a family matter. I understand, Jenkins said, though he made no move to leave. But this is big news, folks. It's not just local anymore. The regional papers have picked it up, and there's talk that Agent Thomas was in town specifically investigating civil rights complaints against the department. Tanner's head snapped up. What complaints? Jenkins looked surprised. You didn't know? There's been a group of Pine Ridge residents working with the ACLU for months, documenting what they call pattern and practice violations. Disproportionate stops, searches, arrests, all targeting minorities. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. Tanner steadied himself against the counter. That's why he was meeting with Henderson. Robert's part of this group. Bingo, Jenkins said. Dr. Henderson is one of the organizers. His data analysis is apparently the backbone of their case. He flipped to a fresh page in his notepad. So about this morning. Get out, Tanner said quietly. Rick, Nancy warned. No, it's okay, Jenkins said, backing toward the door. But this story isn't going away, Officer Tanner. People have questions and they deserve answers. After Jenkins left, Tanner sank into a kitchen chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. This was bigger. And he'd walked right into it. Nancy sat across from him, her face troubled. What are you going to do? I don't know, he admitted. His phone buzzed again. A text from his son, Michael. Dad, is it true? Everyone at school is talking about it. Tanner put the phone down without answering. How could he explain to his 17-year-old son what he barely understood himself? The rest of the day passed in a blur of ignored calls and avoided conversations. By evening, Tanner had retreated to the back porch with his third beer, staring out at the gathering darkness. The sliding door opened and Nancy stepped out with her tablet. You need to see this. She handed him the device. On the screen was a news website with the headline, FBI Civil Rights Investigation in Pine Ridge Reveals Pattern of Biased Policing. Below was a photo of Agent Thomas in a press conference, looking composed and professional as he addressed a room of reporters. We are not focusing on any single officer, Thomas was quoted as saying. Rather, we're examining systemic issues within the department that have allowed these patterns to develop and persist. Tanner felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Thomas wasn't making it personal. Somehow that made it worse. Nancy sat beside him. Rick, I think you need to talk to someone. Like who? A lawyer. Eventually, maybe. But I meant someone who can help you understand why this happened. Why you did what you did. Tanner laughed bitterly. You want me to see a shrink? I want you to be honest with yourself, Nancy said. For once, they sat in silence as darkness fell completely. In the distance, Tanner could hear the wail of a police siren, his colleagues continuing the work he'd been barred from doing. What if I can't go back? He finally asked, his voice small in the night. What if this is it? Nancy's hand found his in the dark. Then you figure out who Rick Tanner is without a badge. Because he has to be someone, doesn't he? The question hung between them unanswered as the stars emerged overhead. 20 years defining himself by a job, by an identity he'd worn like armor. Now that armor had been stripped away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, human. And for the first time in years, Officer Richard Tanner, now just Rick, felt the terrifying possibility of change. A week into his suspension, Rick Tanner had developed an unwanted routine. Wake up after Nancy left for her teaching job. Avoid the windows where neighbors might see him. Ignore calls from fellow officers who were suddenly full of questions about his past arrests. Pretend not to notice how his son Michael barely spoke to him anymore. Today he sat at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold, scrolling through news articles about himself. The latest headline read, Internal Affairs expands investigation into Officer Tanner's arrest record. His phone rang. Sergeant Chen from Internal Affairs. He almost didn't answer, but after 4 rings he swiped the screen. Tanner. Rick, we need you to come in this afternoon, Chen said without preamble. We've been reviewing your arrest data from the past 5 years. A cold feeling spread through his chest. And we should discuss it in person. 2 o'clock. She hung up before he could respond. Rick set the phone down carefully as if it might explode. 5 years of arrests. Hundreds of traffic stops, citations, warnings. He'd never kept count of who was white, black, Hispanic, Asian. He'd just done his job, hadn't he? He showered and dressed in civilian clothes. Jeans and a button-down that felt strange after years in uniform. As he headed for his truck, Mrs. Delgado from next door was watering her flowers. She looked up, hesitated, then gave a small wave. It was more acknowledgement than most neighbors had offered since the news broke. At the station, Rick used the side entrance. Walking through the main doors felt too much like coming home, and this wasn't home anymore. Not now. Chen was waiting in a small conference room with a laptop and several thick folders. No friendly smile today, just a businesslike nod to the chair across from her. We've analyzed your traffic stops and arrests from January 2019 through last week, she said, opening one of the folders. The pattern is clear, Rick. Black drivers were 4 times more likely to be stopped by you than white drivers. Hispanic drivers 3 times, Asian drivers 2 times. That's impossible, Rick said, though something inside him had already accepted the truth of it. I don't target people based on race. Chen slid a paper across the table. These are your own reports, Rick. Your own data. The numbers stared back at him, undeniable. Columns of statistics that painted a picture he didn't want to see. Maybe those demographics reflect who was actually breaking the law. He tried. Chen's expression hardened. We compared your data with the other officers who patrolled the same areas during the same shifts. No one else shows these disparities. She turned her laptop toward him. On the screen was a map of Pine Ridge with hundreds of small dots indicating traffic stops. Blue for white drivers, red for minorities. The blue dots are fairly evenly distributed throughout town, Chen explained. The red dots are concentrated in just a few areas: Pine Ridge Estates, Westbrook Avenue, and the University District. Those are high-traffic areas, Rick protested. They're areas where most of our non-white residents live or work, Chen countered. And there's more. We've identified 12 cases where you conducted searches without proper consent or probable cause, all involving minority drivers. In 8 of those cases, you found nothing but still issued citations for minor infractions. Rick's mouth went dry. This is a witch hunt. This is accountability. Chen closed the laptop. The FBI has requested all of this data for their own investigation. Agent Thomas is personally overseeing the case. Of course he was. What happens now? Rick asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. The department is offering you a choice, Chen said. Resign voluntarily, or face termination after the investigation concludes. Either way, Rick, you won't be returning to duty. 20 years gone, I need time to think, he said. Chen nodded. You have until Friday, and Rick? The chief asked me to tell you that if you resign, the department won't contest your pension. If you force a termination hearing, all bets are off. Outside the station, Rick sat in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, though the engine wasn't running. Rain had started to fall, streaking down the windshield and blurring the world beyond. His phone buzzed with a text from Nancy. How did it go? He couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he drove. Past the neighborhoods he'd patrolled for years. Past the high school where Michael was probably sitting in class trying to ignore whispers about his dad. Past the university where Agent Thomas had been meeting with Dr. Henderson, setting this whole nightmare in motion. Without meaning to, he found himself parking outside the Bluebird Cafe. It had been the officers' unofficial gathering spot for decades, a place where cops could relax after shifts. Through the window, he could see a few familiar faces: Johnson, Rivera, Patel, people he'd called friends. Would they welcome him now or turn away? He was still debating whether to go in when someone tapped on his window. Officer Dwayne Wilson, a 26-year-old who joined the force just 3 years ago. One of the few black officers in the department. Rick rolled down his window. Wilson, thought that was you, Wilson said, rain dampening his civilian clothes. Mind if I join you for a minute? Rick gestured to the passenger seat and Wilson hurried around to get in. Didn't expect to see you here, Rick said. I'm meeting Rivera and Patel for lunch, Wilson explained. You coming in? Rick shook his head. Not sure I'd be welcome. Wilson studied him for a long moment. You know, when I first joined the department, you were the one who showed me the ropes. I respected you. The past tense hung between them, but, Rick prompted. But I also saw how you treated people who looked like me when they weren't in uniform, Wilson said quietly. I told myself it wasn't personal, that you were just old school. I made excuses for you, Tanner. The words stung more than Rick expected. I never had a problem with you, Rick said defensively. Because I was one of the good ones, right? Wilson's voice was tired rather than angry. Because I wore the same uniform so you could see past my skin color. Rick looked away, unable to meet Wilson's gaze. You know what hurts the most? Wilson continued. You were a good cop in so many ways. You knew this town. You cared about it. You could have been better than this. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, Rick said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. That's the problem, Wilson said. You never stopped to think about it at all. They sat in silence as the rain drummed on the roof of the truck. They're going to fire me, Rick finally said. Or I can resign, Wilson nodded. Word travels fast. What would you do? Honestly, I'd take a long, hard look at that arrest data. I'd ask myself some tough questions, and then I'd try to make it right however I could. Make it right? Rick laughed bitterly. How exactly am I supposed to do that? Wilson opened the door. That's for you to figure out. But it starts with admitting there's something to fix. He paused. Whatever you decide, Tanner, this doesn't have to be the end of your story. Just the end of a chapter. After Wilson left, Rick sat watching the rain, his former colleague's words echoing in his mind. The end of a chapter. But what would the next one look like? His phone rang, Nancy again. This time, he answered. They want me to resign, he said without preamble. Her sigh carried the weight of disappointment but not surprise. Maybe that's for the best. How can you say that? This job is everything to me. Is it? Or is it just what's familiar? Her voice softened. Rick, I've watched you change over the years. The man I married was idealistic, wanted to protect people. Somewhere along the way you started seeing threats instead of neighbors. That's not fair, he protested. Maybe not, but it's true. There was a pause. Michael asked if we're going to have to move. The thought hadn't even occurred to Rick. Why would we move? Because people are looking at us differently now. Because your son is carrying the weight of what you did. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. Michael, 17 and trying to figure out who he was, now saddled with his father's disgrace. I'll fix this, Rick said, though he had no idea how. You can't fix other people's perceptions, Nancy replied gently. You can only work on yourself. After they hung up, Rick drove home through the rain-slicked streets of Pine Ridge. The town he'd sworn to protect now felt like it was closing in around him. Every familiar landmark a reminder of what he stood to lose. At home, he found Michael sitting at the kitchen table with schoolbooks spread out before him. The boy looked up when Rick entered, his expression guarded. Hey, Rick said. Hey. Michael turned back to his books. Rick opened the refrigerator, closed it without taking anything. How was school? A shrug. Fine. Anyone giving you trouble? About, Michael looked up, his face suddenly older than his 17 years. You mean about my dad being all over the news for harassing a black FBI agent? Yeah, Dad, there might have been some comments. The sarcasm cut deep. Save it, Michael interrupted. Coach Turner took me aside today. Asked if I was okay at home, like he thought you might be some kind of monster. What did you tell him? Michael gathered his books. I told him I didn't know anymore. Because the truth is, I don't know who you are right now. As his son left the room, Rick sank into a chair, the weight of the day, of the past week, finally crushing him. He'd lost his badge, his reputation, and now, possibly, his son's respect. In the quiet kitchen with rain tapping against the windows, Rick Tanner faced the hardest question of his life. If he wasn't a cop anymore, who was he? And more importantly, who did he want to become? The answer didn't come easily. But as the afternoon faded into evening, one thing became clear. The old Rick Tanner, the one who saw the world in simple terms of us versus them, couldn't survive in this new reality. Either he would change or he would break completely. And despite everything, he wasn't ready to break. Not yet. Rick Tanner signed his resignation letter on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the encounter with Agent Thomas. The pen felt heavy in his hand as he scrawled his signature on the crisp department letterhead. 20 years of service reduced to a single page of carefully worded legalese that mentioned personal reasons, but nothing about bias or discrimination. Chief Williams accepted the letter without comment, just a tight nod and a handshake that ended too quickly. Your pension paperwork will be processed next week, he said, already turning back to his computer. The department thanks you for your service. Just like that, it was over. Rick cleaned out his locker in an empty locker room. Someone had arranged for him to come in during shift change when the space would be deserted. A small mercy or a final humiliation. He couldn't decide which. As he packed his few personal items into a cardboard box, he heard footsteps behind him. Figured you might be here. Rick turned to find Officer Wilson leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. Come to see me off, Rick asked, trying to keep the bitterness from his voice. Wilson shrugged. Something like that. He stepped into the room. Heard you're taking the resignation deal. Not much choice. Rick closed his locker for the last time. It was that or fight and lose everything. Smart move. Wilson hesitated, then extended his hand. Whatever happened, we worked together a long time. Rick stared at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it. I never had anything against you, Wilson. I know that. Wilson's grip was firm. That's what makes this whole thing so complicated, isn't it? You never thought you had anything against anybody. The words stung with their simple truth. What happens now? Rick asked, picking up his box. The FBI investigation, I mean. Agent Thomas is still gathering evidence. But word is he's focusing more on department policies than individual officers. Wilson gave a wry smile. Your resignation probably helped with that. Makes you look like an isolated problem rather than a symptom of something bigger. Rick absorbed this. So the department throws me under the bus and carries on as usual? Pretty much. Though Chen's pushing for implicit bias training for everyone, and they're talking about changing how traffic stops are documented. Wilson walked with Rick toward the exit. Small steps, but it's something. Outside, the spring sunshine felt too bright, too cheerful for the occasion. Rick squinted against it as he loaded his box into the truck. Take care of yourself, Tanner, Wilson said. And hey, he paused. People can change, if they want to. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was the closest thing Rick had heard to it in weeks. The drive home felt like passing through a town he barely recognized. Streets he'd patrolled thousands of times now seemed to belong to someone else's life. He caught himself automatically noting traffic violations, watching for suspicious behavior. Old habits useless now. At home, Nancy was waiting with lunch laid out on the table, sandwiches and chips like it was just another day. How did it go? She asked, pouring iced tea. Quick, quiet. Rick set his box on the counter. It's done. They ate in silence for a while. This had become their new normal. Careful conversations, long pauses, trying to find their way back to each other through the wreckage of his career. I talked to Michael's guidance counselor yesterday, Nancy said finally. He's been skipping classes. Rick set down his sandwich. Since when? Couple of weeks now. Since this all started. She twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd developed recently. He's angry, Rick. Confused. I'll talk to him. He needs more than talk. Nancy met his eyes. He needs to see you taking responsibility. Really taking it, not just losing your job and complaining about it. The accusation stung. What do you want from me, Nancy? I resigned. I'm done. That's the problem. You think this is the end of something? When it should be the beginning. She stood, carrying her plate to the sink. There's a town hall meeting tonight about policing reforms. Agent Thomas will be there along with community leaders. I think you should go. Are you kidding me? Walk into a room full of people who hate me? They don't hate you, Rick. They don't even know you. She turned to face him. Maybe it's time they did. The community center was packed by the time Rick arrived. He slipped in the back door, taking a seat in the last row. From here, he could see the panel at the front. Agent Thomas, Chief Williams, Mayor Gardner, Dr. Henderson, and two community activists Rick didn't recognize. Agent Thomas was speaking, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. The goal isn't punishment. It's transformation. We want to help this department become a model for community-oriented policing. Rick studied the FBI agent, trying to reconcile this measured, thoughtful man with the threat he'd perceived that morning in Pine Ridge Estates. Had he really seen a danger, or just a black man who didn't fit his idea of who belonged? The uncomfortable answer settled in his chest like a stone. Questions from the audience followed. Parents worried about their children being profiled. Business owners concerned about over-policing in certain neighborhoods. Elderly residents who felt unsafe but feared calling the police might make things worse. Each story chipped away at Rick's defenses, his certainty that he'd just been doing his job. Then a familiar voice rose from the middle of the room. My name is Michael Tanner. My dad was Officer Richard Tanner. Rick froze as his son stood up, gangly in his Pine Ridge High School hoodie. The crowd murmured, heads turning to look for Rick. My dad lost his job because of what happened with Agent Thomas. Michael continued, his voice shaking slightly. A lot of people in this town think he got what he deserved. Maybe he did. But I've been thinking about something my history teacher said about systems versus individuals. The room grew quiet. My dad was wrong, Michael said, but he's also the guy who taught me to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. He's the one who made me return a wallet we found at the park, with all the money still in it. He always told me character matters more than anything. Rick felt his throat tighten. So I guess what I'm asking is, how do we fix this? Not just my dad, but all of it? Because I don't think firing one cop solves the real problem. Agent Thomas leaned forward to his microphone. That's an excellent question, Michael. And you're right. This isn't about any single officer. It's about patterns and practices that have been normalized over time. He looked out over the crowd. Accountability matters. But so does redemption. So does growth. After the meeting broke into smaller discussion groups, Rick slipped out, not ready to face his neighbors or former colleagues. He waited in the parking lot for Michael, who emerged nearly an hour later. They spotted each other across the asphalt. For a moment, neither moved. Then Michael walked over, hands shoved in his pockets. "Didn't know you'd be here," he said. "Your mom suggested it." Rick hesitated. "I heard what you said in there." Michael studied the ground. "Yeah, well, thank you." His son looked up. "For what?" "For believing I can be better than what I've shown." Rick's voice cracked. "I'm trying to figure out how to do that." Michael nodded, something like hope flickering across his face. "There's a guy in there, Mr. Washington. He runs this program where former cops talk to kids about police interactions. How to stay safe, know your rights, that kind of thing." He shuffled his feet. "He asked if you might want to help out." "Me?" Rick blinked in surprise. "Why would he want me?" "Because you know both sides now," Michael said simply. "At least you're starting to." They drove home in companionable silence, the first real peace between them in weeks. As they pulled into the driveway, Michael spoke again. "Dad, Agent Thomas asked to talk to you." Rick's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What about?" "Don't know. But he said whenever you're ready, he'd like to meet." "Not as an FBI agent, just as a person." That night, Rick sat on the back porch long after Nancy and Michael had gone to bed. The stars spread out overhead, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. His phone lay on the table beside him. He picked it up, scrolled to the business card he'd photographed weeks ago. Special Agent Dr. Andre Thomas, Civil Rights Division. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before he set the phone down again. Not yet, but soon maybe. Inside, he heard the refrigerator door open, then close. Footsteps approached, and Nancy appeared with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Just thinking." He accepted the tea gratefully. "Michael said Agent Thomas wants to talk to me. Are you going to call him?" "I don't know." Rick looked up at the stars. "What would I even say?" Nancy's hand found his in the darkness. "Maybe start with 'I'm sorry,' and then listen. You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," she said. "Not easy, but simple." They sat together as the night deepened around them. 20 years of marriage, much of it defined by his badge and gun. Now they were figuring out who they were without those things. "I'm thinking about what Michael said," Rick finally admitted. "About helping with that program for kids. The one teaching black and brown children how to safely interact with police?" Nancy's voice held no judgment, just curiosity. "Yeah. Seems like I might have some insight there." He gave a humorless laugh. From the wrong side, but still. "It's a start." Nancy squeezed his hand. "A step toward making amends." Rick nodded, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but possibility. The man he'd been was gone, along with the badge that had defined him. But perhaps in the spaces left behind, a better version of Rick Tanner could begin to take shape. 6 months after his resignation, Rick Tanner pulled into the parking lot of Pine Ridge Community College. The campus was quiet on this Saturday morning, just a few students crossing between buildings with backpacks and coffee cups. Rick checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed. The face looking back at him was older somehow, the lines deeper than he remembered. He straightened his tie, a habit from his uniform days that hadn't quite died. The community center was easy to find, with a banner out front announcing Youth and Law Enforcement Dialogue Series. Inside, about 20 teenagers sat in a semicircle of chairs. They looked up as he entered, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. At the front of the room stood Agent Thomas, dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual suit. He nodded at Rick with a small smile. "Good morning," he said to the group. "Today we're joined by Richard Tanner, former officer with the Pine Ridge Police Department. He's here to share his perspective and answer your questions." Rick took a seat at the front, hands clasped to hide their slight tremor. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined sitting across from Agent Thomas, or Andre, as he'd insisted Rick call him, in anything resembling a friendly conversation. Now they'd met for coffee twice, spoken on the phone more times than he could count. Not friends exactly, but something neither man had a name for. "Thank you for having me," Rick began. His mouth felt dry. "I'm not sure what Andre has told you about me, but I'm guessing some of you already know my story." A few nods, a few whispers. News traveled fast in Pine Ridge. "For 20 years I was a police officer in this town. I thought I was one of the good ones." He paused, feeling the weight of those words. "I was wrong." The room went quiet. "I'm here because I made mistakes, serious ones, and I'm trying to learn from them. I'm here because maybe my experience can help you understand how good people can do harmful things without even realizing it." For the next hour, Rick talked about implicit bias, about how he'd never seen himself as racist but had acted in ways that harmed people of color. He talked about the patterns in his traffic stops that he'd never bothered to notice, about how losing his badge had forced him to confront truths he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Then came the questions. Hard ones from kids who'd had their own experiences with police. "Did you ever plant evidence?" asked a boy in the back row. "No," Rick said firmly. "I crossed lines, but never that one." "Would you have stopped Agent Thomas if he'd been white?" asked a girl with braided hair. Rick met her eyes. "I'd like to say no, but the data on my traffic stops tells a different story. So probably not." "Do you think you deserve to lose your job?" This from a quiet boy who'd been watching intently the whole time. Rick took a deep breath. "Yes, and it took me too long to admit that." Afterward, as the teens filtered out, Andre approached. "That went well," he said. "You didn't sugarcoat anything. What would be the point?" Rick shrugged. "They'd see right through it." Andre nodded toward the door. "Walk with me?" Outside, they strolled across the campus in companionable silence. Students lounged on the grass enjoying the fall sunshine. "The department vote is next week," Andre finally said. "On the reforms," Rick nodded. He'd been following the news closely. After months of community input and FBI guidance, the Pine Ridge Police Department was poised to adopt new policies on everything from traffic stops to use of force. "Think it'll pass?" "Chief Williams is pushing hard for it, and the union's on board, surprisingly." Andre stopped by a bench overlooking a small pond. "Your testimony helped with that?" Rick sat, remembering the day he'd spoken to his former colleagues about his own biased policing. How he'd shown them his own data, laid bare the patterns he'd never acknowledged, the stunned faces of officers who probably saw themselves in his story. "Small step," Rick said. "Big enough." Andre took a seat beside him. "The Community Oversight Board wants you, by the way." Rick looked up in surprise. "Me? Why would they want an ex-cop with my record?" "Because you understand both sides now. And because you've done the work these past 6 months." Andre smiled slightly. "Those dialogues with the youth group, the bias training sessions you've helped with, your honesty about your own mistakes, it matters." "I don't know. Some people in town still cross the street when they see me coming. Change takes time. Trust takes even longer." Andre watched a pair of ducks glide across the pond. Think about it, at least. They parted with a handshake that had grown easier over the months. Rick drove home slowly, mulling over the conversation. Home was different now, a small apartment near the high school. Nancy had moved back to her hometown over the summer, taking Michael with her for his senior year. The divorce papers had arrived 3 months ago. Amicable but final, like so much else in his dismantled life. The apartment was quiet when he entered. No TV, no music, just the hum of the refrigerator. He'd grown to appreciate the silence, the space to think. His phone rang. "Michael. Hey, Dad. How'd it go today?" Their conversations had a careful rhythm now, rebuilt from the ashes of those terrible weeks after the incident. "Good, I think. The kids asked tough questions. That's what kids do." Michael paused. "Mom said to tell you I got accepted to state, full scholarship." Pride swelled in Rick's chest. "That's fantastic, buddy. Criminal justice, right?" "Yeah, Another pause. I've been thinking maybe I want to work for the FBI someday. Civil Rights Division like Agent Thomas. The irony wasn't lost on Rick, his son inspired by the man who'd ended his career. Yet somehow it felt right. You'd be good at that, he said honestly. They talked a while longer about school, about Michael's upcoming visit for Thanksgiving, about the reforms at the police department. When they hung up, Rick felt the familiar mixture of loss and hope that had become his constant companion. On the kitchen counter sat a flyer for his evening plans, a community dialogue at the Pine Ridge Baptist Church. These gatherings had become a regular part of his week. Sometimes he spoke, sharing his journey from denial to accountability. More often, he listened as people of color described experiences he'd once dismissed or minimized. Tonight's topic: building trust after harm. He changed into more casual clothes and walked the 10 blocks to the church. The evening air held the first hint of winter, crisp and clear. The church basement was already half full when he arrived. A mix of faces, black and white, old and young. He recognized some, neighbors, former colleagues, parents of Michael's friends. Others were strangers, drawn by shared concern for their community. He took a seat near the back, nodding at familiar faces. Some nodded back. Progress, small but real. Pastor Jones opened the meeting with a simple welcome. We're here tonight to continue our conversation about healing and justice in Pine Ridge. No easy answers, just honest talk between neighbors. As the discussion began, Rick found himself thinking about the strange path that had led him here. 6 months ago, his world had collapsed around him. The job, the identity, the certainty, all gone in the space of a few days. Yet here he sat, listening more carefully than he ever had as an officer. Learning names and stories, facing uncomfortable truths without the shield of a badge to hide behind. A woman he didn't recognize was speaking about her teenage son's fear of police. He does everything right, hands visible, yes sir, no sir, but his heart races every time he sees a patrol car. How do we change that? Before Rick knew what he was doing, his hand was in the air. The facilitator nodded to him. Mr. Tanner? Every eye in the room turned to him. The former cop, the man who'd become a reluctant symbol of the problem they were all there to solve. I don't have an answer, he said honestly, but I want to be part of finding one. After the meeting, Rick helped stack chairs and clean up paper cups. Simple tasks, nothing like the high-stakes work of policing, yet somehow more meaningful than much of what he'd done wearing a badge. As he walked home under a sky full of stars, his phone buzzed with a text from Andre. Thought more about the oversight board? Rick stopped on the sidewalk, thinking of all that had happened, all that still needed to change. In his mind, he heard Michael's voice from months ago. How do we fix this? He typed his reply. I'm in. Back at his apartment, Rick opened his laptop. The blank document stared back at him. His application for the Community Oversight Board. At the top, the form asked for a statement of purpose. He began to type. My name is Richard Tanner. For 20 years, I was part of a system that I didn't question enough. Now I'm learning to see with new eyes. The words came slowly at first, then faster. Not excuses or defenses, but the simple truth of a man coming to terms with his past while reaching for a different future. Outside his window, Pine Ridge carried on. A town working through its own reckoning, its own slow journey toward something better. And for the first time in months, Rick felt like he might have a place in that future after all. Not as an officer, but as something he was still becoming. The man in the mirror was still a work in progress. The journey ahead still long and uncertain, but at least now he was walking in the right direction.